Hello YouTube, this is DVD Review Studios here, and today I shall be doing a collection overview looking at the Planet of the Apes movie franchise, of which in this video we shall be going through each individual movie in their release order, and looking at all 9 of them, ranking them from my least favourite to my personal favourite. And so, beginning of course with the 5 films that originally came out in the late 60s through to the early 70s, we have quite a lot of detail to cover going into the Tim Burton remake, and then finally the 3 films from the reboot series of Planet of the Apes. And so, beginning with the 1 through to 5 box set, let us have a look and see where this movie franchise began. Here's a look at the special edition DVD box set, which contains all 5 of the original Planet of the Apes movies, along with the bonus inclusion of the late 90s TV documentary behind the Planet of the Apes, which is a really neat inclusion. It's quite the extensive look at the 5 films, just over 2 hours long, narrated by good old Roddy McDowall, which was a nice touch. And so there's the front cover with the very iconic decimated Statue of Liberty, with George Taylor there at the bottom, and then some silhouettes there of man and ape, which I believe is actually taken from Battle of the Planet of the Apes, so it's a nice touch to see both the first and last movies represented there on the front cover. There's the spine with the list of movies there that are included. And then if you wish to pause and read over the brief summaries of each individual film there, you are welcome to do so. And then we have the spec of each film, including the runtime there. Again, if you wanted to have a look at that, you can pause and read through. And the entire box set is rated a 15 here in the UK, and that's mainly due to the second film beneath the Planet of the Apes. And so, without further ado, let us begin our look through the original 5 movies. Beginning, of course, with the original 1968 science fiction classic, we have Planet of the Apes, directed by Franklin J. Schaffner. And this film is one that, to a degree, I can describe really as timeless. Things such as the practical effects obviously don't look as good as you may expect them to, but the main thing that I'm kind of drawn to with this film is the overall aesthetic design of what is considered to be the far distant future. And I say that since in the original source material, the 1963 novel by French novelist Pierre Boulle, the Ape City as it's described seems far more dystopian, and in this rendition, obviously based on that novel, it seems to acquire its own aesthetic as to what it considers the ape village to look like, which is literally a small kind of cave-like civilization. And I think that gives it its own unique charm without necessarily tying it down to a specific time period, and stuff like that is what I really do appreciate about this film and how I feel it's maintained its rewatchability over the years. But obviously we have the incredible story as well, which is the main focus. And so, starring Charlton Heston, we have him portraying the character of George Taylor, who is an astronaut aboard a spacecraft with the mission of seeking out a new planet and a new civilization where the characters end up in stasis and accidentally crash land out of light speed onto what appears to be a new planet. And what they discover is the man on this planet are quite primitive, and they just assume that they will eventually be running the place. But things take a turn for the worse when they discover that apes have now risen as the dominant species above man, and that humans are basically used for sport, experimentation, which obviously challenges the aspect of things such as animal cruelty, where funnily enough, one of the human characters is literally shot straight away by one of the horse-riding apes. And so from there, the characters don't really know what to do and end up being captured. And so Taylor, throughout this sequence, is actually shot and rendered unable to speak, but is actually imprisoned and survives his injuries. And so throughout this sequence, he is actually part of an animal psychologist group, which introduces us to the character of Zero, one of the ape characters, who is kind of humble and somewhat engaging, which I found to be quite surprising for someone in the role of what is presumed to be an animal psychologist, especially with the role reversal, which is quite interesting. And then my favourite character, the antagonist from this film, is of course Dr. Zaius. Dr. Zaius, Dr. Zaius! Obviously I had to throw that in there, but with Dr. Zaius as an antagonist, he's actually quite the complex character. He's all about simian survival with no regard for human life at all, instantly requesting for Taylor to just simply be exterminated as though he's just another primitive human, when really he knows a lot more than he is actually letting on. And with this, Zira actually discovers this in who she nicknames now Bright Eyes in Taylor, since Taylor is unable to speak, but he shows more cognitive emotion and a clear sense of intelligence beyond what the other primitive humans specifically have. And writing a note simply stating his name to Zira, this piques her curiosity, and so she actually allows Taylor to be let out of his cage and brings him home with her husband Cornelius, where they further examine Taylor. But once again, they are threatened by Dr. Zaius, who basically sees to Taylor being castrated from the sounds of things. And so now Taylor escapes, where he is now basically testing the faith of Dr. Zaius and all the other apes by challenging the so-called sacred scrolls, competing with the known knowledge within those scrolls supposedly, and the science of what is understood about humans being primitive. And this gives us the iconic scene of Taylor rebelling against ape kind.
Take your stinking paws off me, you damn dirty ape!
This breaks the ideology of humans being primitive, and so if Taylor can speak showing signs of intelligence, how is this supposed to be explained by these so-called sacred scrolls? And this is where things slowly begin to unravel, that all along this has been nothing more than just a cover-up. This is most apparent in one of my favourite scenes from the movie, where Taylor finds one of the other astronauts, Landon, who has actually been lobotomized in quite a gruesome reveal scene. And so caught once again, Cornelius and Zira actually empathize with Taylor and help him escape to an archaeological dig site which houses evidence of a previous culture, that being the previous existence or iteration of mankind, where a human doll that speaks is discovered, disproving Zaius, who basically just wants to restore order. He doesn't want the apes to believe in anything that was previous to ape kind existing. And so by keeping ape kind ignorant, Dr. Zaius essentially wins.
I love you, Dr. Zaius!
And building from all of this, we have the big reveal, or the big realization, which is arguably one of the most iconic sequences in cinema history, and that is the realization that Taylor all along has actually still been on planet Earth, and that everything he has ever known, everybody he ever knew, is long gone, just cementing his entrapment on planet Earth, thousands of years in the future amongst a civilization of apes where he is now no longer relevant. And that ending, even though it is obviously supposed to be as bleak as possible, is a powerful ending about mankind destroying itself. And I kind of wish this was just where it ended, since the sequels, even though they do have creative stories behind them, this ending is something that just could not be topped. And I feel, especially with how I place this in my top 9, as I'll term it, the number 2 spot, this is an incredible film, powerful in terms of what it represents, and holds up really well. Like I mentioned before, it does feel timeless, and with many iconic cinematic moments, is a film that is only going to over time become all the more powerful in terms of what it represents. But sadly, it's let down by the sequels that follow, which leads us into Beneath the Planet of the Apes.
The vision was false!
Directed by Ted Post and released in 1970, we have Beneath the Planet of the Apes, which is definitely what I would term as the pure definition of a cash grab sequel. And this film has some of the most bizarre production-related stories about it, which I would definitely recommend reading into out of morbid curiosity, if nothing else, where everything about this film feels really forced and unnecessary, such as with the original production issues of the film relating to Fox and various monetary concerns, where they literally sliced the budget of this movie in half, which was a very strange step in the wrong direction, to put it lightly. And then with the remainder of what actually went wrong with this film, with how forced it seemed, there were so many strange ideas pitched for its conception, such as the most predictable in the form of a man uprising against ape, and then really bizarre things such as the shock of an ape man-child being born, obviously cut due to, for better lack of a phrase, bestiality concerns. And with the original director not interested in pursuing a sequel, Charlton Heston wasn't really interested in the movie anyway, but agreed to basically do a cameo, which is nothing short of what he did anyway for this film. And even though he did actually play a part in the film, he agreed to only do so if his character died. And then we have Roddy McDowall, who was possibly one of the best portraying actors in the original film, playing Cornelius. He was unavailable to continue the role of Cornelius in this film, so he was replaced. And so the majority of the film just feels incredibly unnecessary and is just something that I really wish didn't exist. And I'll detail my reasons why as we journey into Beneath the Planet of the Apes. And so, with all that taken into consideration, this film is creative, but in my honest opinion, for all the wrong reasons. And with this movie, we begin by literally recapping the previous installment, taking at least 5 minutes worth of recycled footage, to then give us a continuation where Taylor and Nova are still riding their horse, only for Taylor to randomly disappear, which is explained much later on in the film. And that gives us the character of Brent, who is essentially Taylor's substitute, portrayed by James Franciscus. And he takes Taylor's place and joins Nova, only for them to end up back at the Ape Village. And a lot of themes really do seem to repeat on themselves, only to a worse degree, such as with the theme of prejudice towards mankind. And we have the guerrilla army taking front and center role, with the lead character of the guerrilla army, General Ursus, who is perhaps the only redeeming character / quality of this film as a whole. He was a character that I quite enjoyed and felt that they could have maybe added a lot more depth to, but I think the enigma surrounding him was a lot more left to be desired to that extent. And so we have various recurring characters. We have Dr. Zaius, who is no longer in the sort of villain role in this particular film, with a lot more character progression challenging his faith. Zira and Cornelius also return, but they are basically just poorly written shadows of what they initially were in the original film, written purely for comic relief, condoning actions such as domestic violence.
Cornelius hit me.
I don't blame him.
And as we continue the story, Brent discovers the decaying ruins of New York, literally beneath the planet of the apes. And so he comes to the same conclusion as Taylor, only he's a little bit more placid in the way that's portrayed compared to Taylor's actions in the previous film. And so he doesn't really show too much emotion for his realization, it's more spoken, which is a real shame. But behind the strange illusions that have been seen throughout the film, such as the flames and stuff like that, they are basically used to keep the apes and everyone away from the so-called Forbidden Zone, which reveals a cave to the underground city of mutant humans with telepathic and telekinetic powers, as they basically use these powers to warn off anyone that comes near their civilization. And the entire send-up of these mutant humans is something that I feel could have been utilized a lot better. The main sort of iconic thing to them is the fact that they worship a giant atomic bomb and for whatever reason wear strange skin suits rather than showing their mutated flesh. And so Brent is imprisoned only to find Taylor in his prison cell, where Taylor and Brent are actually forced to fight one another to the death by these telepathic humans who state that they don't kill their enemies, they make their enemies kill their enemies. And so in this finale fight sequence, we have the apes discovering this underground city, and in an all-out fight, Taylor sets off the bomb and destroys the entire planet, which is a ridiculously bleak ending compared to the original. And yet this film still managed to spawn 3 more sequels. It's unbelievable in my honest opinion, and this genuinely is one of the most disinteresting and overall very unsatisfying films I've seen, especially for a sequel. And to be honest, I'm just going to put this at the worst spot in my top 9, at the number 9 position.
Your luggage, ma'am?
Of course it's mine.
Despite mixed reviews of the previous installment, along with the ending to that film cementing an end for the Planet of the Apes, the executives over at Fox had very different ideas where they greenlit yet another sequel, as there was still obviously some profit to be made of some description. And so in 1971, directed by Don Taylor, we now have Escape from the Planet of the Apes, which is a very different movie compared to the other sequels. It's a very strange film. It doesn't really carry over the themes of what we initially had in the previous two films, and acts almost like a prequel with the time travel stuff taken into consideration, which is very convoluted. And so, with that in mind, the minor bit of exposition that we are given is that just before the end of the world, the characters of Zira, Cornelius, and this irrelevant ape character called Milo managed to rebuild Taylor's spacecraft. And through the original paradox that Taylor traveled through, they managed to reverse these effects. And the ape characters end up crash landing in 1973. And with that in mind, I think that in itself could have been a very interesting plot, or at least an act in the film. But this aspect is overlooked simply to bring in the ape characters as a novelty. The film is basically played for laughs and is more or less a sitcom-style comedy. And Zira and Cornelius both as written characters, and for what they are in this film compared to their original portrayals, they are basically exploited on screen, and it's a real shame to really see what happens to these characters over the course of the film, as we see them go through various struggles both with imprisonment from the government that don't quite understand what they have come across, along with them both becoming celebrities and being capitalized on by the media just as basically a freak show attraction, which is a real shame considering what these characters represented in their own world and now brought into mankind's world. Things are definitely very different. And this comes into play particularly when news of Zira falling pregnant travels far. And so now the tables have turned, where the apes are now considered to be a threat to humanity, with the unborn child now seemingly a threat to the human race, and now the apes in general a threat after they reveal the events of the previous two films under the influence of truth serum, with the end of the world taken into consideration. And so now the apes must go on the run, and so this sequence is probably the most eventful from the entire film, and as they are trying to stay in hiding and escape from the government, Zira has the child, obviously yet another intelligent talking ape. And with this in mind, the characters are backed into what is obviously yet again with this ongoing theme, another bleak ending, as the characters are in fact killed. Only with a surprising turn of events, we actually have some genuine sequel bait, since the sequels so far weren't actually planned. But we have the sequel bait for Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, with the child that was born, little baby Milo, who is thought to have actually been killed, was actually swapped over with a gorilla baby from the circus. And so the end shot shows little baby Milo talking, who has been swapped out, and actually survives. And so that is the cliffhanger that we're left on. And this film, it's okay. It's definitely, like I said before, the most different out of these sequels. It's comedic. Very strange, another obvious, somewhat cash cow, I guess you could say, but overall it's an okay movie, and certainly a film that I don't have too much of a big gripe with anyhow, and I would place this at my number 5 spot in the top 9 list. Set 18 years after the events of Escape from the Planet of the Apes, we now have Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, which was released in 1972, directed by J. Lee Thompson, who directed the last 2 Planet of the Apes movies out of the original 5. And this film is okay. It's a very strange depiction of the ape revolution led by what is supposed to be little baby Milo, all grown up from the last film, who is now renamed to Caesar. And so, in this film, Caesar is secretly raised by the owner of the circus from the last film, Armando, portrayed by Ricardo Montalban. And so, Armando is quite an interesting character. He's somewhat shady to a degree, where he's basically trying to protect the identity of Caesar from the authorities. And in this film, apes are now considered to basically be household pets, which is an interesting turn of events, where in some spoken exposition it's revealed that cats and dogs are now long gone, wiped out by a plague. And so apes have now taken their position as household pets and as slaves, which is a really interesting turn of events where apes are now basically being mistreated. And seeing apes come to harm, Caesar yells out in public, "Lousy human bastards," which draws unwanted suspicion about a talking ape, with rumors obviously circulating from what happened to Zira and Cornelius from the previous installment. And so in order to protect Caesar and his identity, Armando orders him to hide amongst some of the other apes, as Armando is taken into custody over the so-called Talking Ape event. And this sequence is really bizarre, where Armando is basically provoked into spilling the truth by a truth-provoking machine where he's supposedly meant to be forced into talking about who Caesar is and whether or not the ape that he has been keeping is the talking ape from all those years ago. And rather than risking revealing anything to law enforcement, Armando commits suicide and jumps out of the window rather than spilling anything about Caesar's identity, which is a really strange turn of events, especially with the so-called truth-provoking machine being nothing but a small light shined on him, which is supposed to make him talk, which I guess in the sci-fi grand scheme of things is not the most unimaginative thing in the world, but it didn't really possess any kind of threat. It was just the threat of accidentally spilling knowledge that seemed to make Armando fear for his life and therefore the life of Caesar, and so he made the ultimate sacrifice on that note. And when Caesar learns of the demise of Armando, this cements within him the ape rebellion against mankind, and against the main antagonist, Governor Breck, who basically wants Caesar dead. And so Caesar begins the revolution, which is a really long action scene, which is kind of difficult to make out in some instances since they've lowered the lighting effects on purpose just so then the background extra apes don't look as daunting with the lack of special effects and makeup and stuff that's been applied to them, or their lack of. And so throughout this sequence we have apes overthrowing law enforcement, which leads us to the very strange ending, Caesar's final speech against humanity, which is butchered by studio interference. And so Caesar is now not going all out with human hate, but instead is empowering himself above humans, which is supposed to apparently make him better than them. Really strange ending. Supposedly the Blu-ray version is uncut with some extra additional more violent sequences included, but otherwise this is an okay sequel. The story method is fine, there's a lot of really unique and interesting ideas included, but obviously it fails in the same way as the other sequels fail, and that's that it just wasn't necessary. And I guess with this one, it's not as bad as some of the other films. It is tolerable. But I'm still going to put this at my number 8 spot out of the top 9.
That's my father.
And so continuing off of the events of the previous installment, we now have Battle for the Planet of the Apes, which was released in 1973, and is supposed to be the final chapter in the so-called Ape Saga of the original 5 films. And this movie is okay, it's certainly not as bad as some of the other sequels, but it still suffers from various continuity errors and is overall just very dissatisfying to an extent, with yet again more exposition from the previous film stating nuclear war has devastated the world for mankind, which would have likely made for a better movie. And so apes are now the dominant species on planet Earth, with some really bizarre role reversals as well, such as Caesar now wanting to encourage peace between apes and mankind, which completely obliterates his entire point in the last film, so I don't quite understand why they decided to go in this direction, but regardless, this film is supposedly meant to be told as a story, as a flashback, almost like a life lesson, and so with that in mind, sticking with the film, the characters, we have Caesar and the main human character McDonald from the last film that Caesar seemed to stick to after the death of Armando. We have this group of characters journeying to the so-called Forbidden Zone as they seek footage of Caesar's parents from the third film when they were made into celebrities. And interestingly, the sequences in this Forbidden Zone actually give some character exposition to the mutated human characters from beneath the Planet of the Apes, where the mutants actually believe that apes are planning an attack, revealing the missile from the very end of the second film, which obviously devastates the entire planet. And this leads us to the character of General Aldo, who is a complicated character at best for the antagonist. He's a gorilla and he's somewhat playing both sides to a degree. He's basically planning to destroy all of human life and provoke the humans into instigating a fight with the apes. And then he also wants to overthrow Caesar and his ideals about humans. And so this instigates the battle where the apes overwhelm an incoming human army, where it's also revealed the General Aldo actually killed Caesar's son to keep this influence going and instigate the battle. And Caesar's reaction was meant to show human emotion, where he is seeking revenge. Sort of. And I guess with that conclusion, the events of these movies are supposed to then technically be on a loop, as we have already established the fact that the mutant humans are now worshipping the atomic bomb from beneath the planet of the apes. But with the way the story is told, it's supposed to be a life lesson about human and ape kind living together peacefully with no prejudice. And so does that mean when George Taylor eventually does go into the future and ends up at the first starting point we began these movies in, is he going to find the exact same variation of what we saw in the films in terms of the ape city, with apes now prejudiced against human beings, or is everything then going to change, which may even retcon what we have seen in the events of these films? Who knows? But anyway, that is the original 5 Planet of the Apes films, and with Battle for the Planet of the Apes, I placed this at the number 6 spot in my top 9. Next up we have the 2001 remake of Planet of the Apes, directed by Tim Burton, which was a film that was in many years of development, going through various stages of production. And as a remake, it has enough changes to really differentiate itself from the original 60s classic, such as renaming the main character, some role reversals throughout, and some loose plot threads and ideas actually taken from Conquest of the Planet of the Apes. But for the film and the way it's portrayed, I do have a lot of mixed feelings on this, especially the aesthetics for one thing. The setting of the film, it doesn't really provide any kind of iconography like the original film did. And some ape costumes and outfits and makeup are fine, but others look incredibly awkward.
That's horrible.
Along with the plot being somewhat contrived as well, with no real logic behind the human prejudice from the apes, which is a little bit unsettling, where humans do show intelligence, such as in the obvious way of speaking, but are still discriminated against, which doesn't quite make sense. Opening in the year 2029, we are introduced to the character of Leo, portrayed by Mark Wahlberg, who is an astronaut positioned on a space station training the chimp character Pericles, who is meant to be training to be sent into check an electromagnetic storm in space, and is sent to do this only for the mission to somewhat fail, or so they think. And then Leo actually follows Pericles and disobeys orders and ends up being thrown forward through time and crash lands on a foreign planet, Ashlor, and you guessed it, is captured by intelligent talking apes.
Take your stinking hands off me, you damn dirty human!
Taking inspiration from the original 60s film, we have the events playing out somewhat similarly, with the character now imprisoned and now seeking help. And he seeks this help from the character that is portraying the empathetic ape role in this situation, and that is Ari, portrayed by Helena Bonham Carter, who is basically the Zira of this movie. And Ari helps Leo escape, and once liberated, the remaining ape and human characters of this little group are now in search of a faint signal, leading them to a crashed spacecraft, which is an interesting turn of events. And that now takes us to the main villain character, the chimp and leader of the gorilla army, General Fade, portrayed by Tim Roth. Challenging General Fade with some story influences taken from Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, with a little bit of a role reversal, where Leo is now creating a counterattack on the Forbidden Zone against the incoming ape army, and he enables the crashed ship to dispense some fuel at the army, creating one hell of an explosion. And the fight sequence that follows and the battle moments throughout are really intricate and well choreographed, which is arguably the best scene in the movie, only to then suddenly be interrupted by the space pod from the beginning of the film containing Pericles the chimp, as this lands mid-battle in the Forbidden Zone, and for whatever reason, the ape characters believe Pericles to be the return of their god, which is where things really do go downhill and get incredibly convoluted. And so from this sequence we have Leo fighting for his life in a 1v1 fight with Thade, and Leo uses the ship wreckage to basically trap Thade inside the control room. And so using Pericles' ship, Leo then believes it's best to basically abandon this place and go back to Earth, only to now discover that mankind has been replaced by apes. Somehow, which is completely unexplained and obviously is clearly setting up some sequel bait. But Thade somehow got to Earth beforehand and conquered mankind, as we see the big reveal that the Washington DC statue of the Lincoln Memorial is now replaced with Thade, and honestly, this is one of the strangest endings, which I genuinely would recommend looking up on YouTube if you don't wish to watch this movie, which I don't blame you, but it may even be worth watching out of morbid curiosity, because the Thade stuff is kind of interesting to that extent, and honestly, I kind of wish that had been a main plot point to somewhat differentiate this film away from the rest of the Planet of the Apes stuff, and would have been a really interesting direction with a time travel kind of storyline thrown into the works as the main source of plot. I guess for what it's worth, this was an okay movie, but certainly very messy at that. It has some interesting character designs and overall some unique aesthetics to say the least, but it's not very pleasing to the eye and was somewhat looking far further ahead for relaunching and reimagining this franchise before even considering the story that they were telling in this initial film, and I think that's its downfall, which is a real shame. Anyhow, with where I would rank this movie in my top 9, I would place this at the number 7 spot. Next up we have the beginning to the modernized trilogy of Planet of the Apes movies, as I like to term it, starting off with Rise of the Planet of the Apes, which came out back in 2011 and was directed by Rupert Wyatt, which is yet another reboot to the franchise, planned surprisingly only a couple of years after cancelling the sequel to the 2001 movie. And so, with a much more modernized rendition with heavy inspiration from Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, this gives us the Ape Revolution with a far more competent sci-fi method, and as we explore the 3 films in this trilogy, that will become all the more apparent, with various themes taken from the original movies, but this is by far, in my opinion, the most competent and overall, to a degree, realistic delivery method for what you can really claim as realism from a science fiction. And with this film, we have the character of Dr. Will Rodman, portrayed wonderfully by James Franco, and this is definitely one of my favourite acting credits for him as an actor, and he is a chemist trying to synthesize a cure for Alzheimer's disease, and there's a very heavy focus on the brain and the development of the brain, specifically with apes over the course of the film. And this is a very strangely believable concept, even to a science fiction degree once again. After only one miracle breakthrough, Will wants to then push for human trials on this drug that they've been testing on various apes, which seems a little bit too optimistic and for unbeknownst reasons thought to be associated with this drug they have been testing called ALZ-112. The successful trial ape, nicknamed Bright Eyes, an obvious homage, becomes very aggressive and, in a very saddening scene, is shot dead. And this really does speak volume about animal testing, and really the way it's portrayed in this film is likely not far off the real thing, and so all the trial apes are killed after it's thought that the research and the many years put into the development of this drug have just been wasted with what it can potentially do to the human race. And so with that in mind, all the other apes are killed apart from one, where it's revealed that Bright Eyes was actually protecting a baby, which turns out to be a little baby Caesar. And so Will takes him home to protect him and actually raises him in secret, and then knowing that the drug isn't actually all that dangerous to his knowledge, his main reason and priority for wanting to find this cure is because of his father Charles, who actually does have Alzheimer's. And so he gives the cure to him, and miraculously it works. Over the course of approximately 8 years, we see Caesar's progression both physically and mentally, but then we sadly also see the downfall of the drug, as Charles has slowly deteriorated, and in one episode, as I like to term it, he ends up being threatened during a violent incursion which encourages Caesar to protect Charles in a very violent way. And so, getting out of hand, he then is taken away to what is presumed to be a sanctuary, which is technically just an ape prison. Having seen other apes come to harm, this brings us the ape revolution side of the story led by Caesar, and despite the CGI, you really do empathize with these ape characters, particularly with when Maurice is comforting Caesar. That was a very touching moment. And I love how continuing into the other two films we have Maurice and Caesar as quite prominent named characters that always seem to have one another's backs. And my absolute favourite scene in this film, which is very iconic to this film as well, is where Caesar stands up to the Keeper with the iconic homage dialogue from the original 60s film, which is delivered in a cheesy way of "take your stinking paw off me, you damn dirty ape," which is followed up by the incredible moment where Caesar roars, "No." And I absolutely loved that moment, especially for the clever sound editing. It's a very breathtaking moment that really does stun the audience. And I absolutely love how there's just an eerie silence following Caesar shouting, and loads of great reaction shots from the humans as well. The remainder of the film gives us a great setup for the sequel, which is, in my opinion, a lot more apparent upon rewatch, where we see a lot more hidden details, surprisingly, where Will is trying to revitalize the Alzheimer's cure with a more aggressive delivery method, making it airborne and giving this to the character of Koba, who is far more apparent in the next film as well. And with this, one of the other chemists, Franklin, is accidentally infected by this cure, and it gives a lot more negative consequences to him, setting up the virus/simian flu story. And with this airborne variation of the cure, which is non-toxic to apes, Caesar breaks out of the ape prison and steals the airborne virus and gives it to all the other apes to heighten their intelligence. And then together they all escape from the so-called ape prison, banding together with the apes from the science lab. And together, this makes for one hell of an action sequence for the ending to the film, and really does reinforce the ape uprising and mankind's losing battle with disease. And this made for a very enjoyable re-establishment to the franchise. The realistic CGI is unbelievable. Of course, we have Andy Serkis portraying through motion capture the main ape character, Caesar. The sign language stuff was a neat inclusion. That was definitely something that I applaud. And this was overall a great setup for the upcoming events. And so I would rank this at the number 3 spot in my top 9.
Human lies! No!
Next up is Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, which came out back in 2014 and was directed by Matt Reeves, who directed the last 2 Planet of the Apes films. And this is by far, in my opinion, the most advanced of the ape movies, with this being quite a hard-hitting film reinforcing the ape dominance of Earth after the effects of the simian flu virus. And so, after a random encounter between Caesar's group of apes and a random group of human survivors, mankind's survival is essentially to a degree in Caesar's hands, and that becomes apparent when a group of humans beg Caesar for his help in restoring a hydroelectric dam to basically get power to their city. And Caesar chooses to help Malcolm and his group, Malcolm being portrayed by Jason Clarke, who is a fantastic actor. And this ignites Koba to conspire against Caesar. Koba has his own personal vendetta against mankind, and understandably so. The segment where he starts pointing at the disfigured scars on his face and declares, "human work," it's a very upsetting scene, and very touching, and as an animal lover myself, I found it to be incredibly evocative as an established reason why he hates humanity so much. And Koba begins to spread his influence amongst the other apes, including Caesar's own son. And after varying misunderstandings, disagreements, and fights between apes, Koba then frames the humans for attacking Caesar and burning down their ape village. And after being shot by Koba, the big reveal is that Caesar is actually found to have survived the injury and is nursed back to health by Malcolm and his group. With this, Koba now has full control, imprisoning the apes that follow Caesar loyally, imprisoning other humans and killing humans and apes at the same time as well in some of the most brutal fashions. And this ignites the ape versus ape story with some absolutely incredible graphics, some phenomenal CGI. And with this, the humans are essentially at this point just mixed up in between the fight, where man is now just paying for their mistakes. And this leads to the incredible final fight between the human antagonist, Dreyfus, portrayed by Gary Oldman, fighting against Caesar and Koba, who are fighting one another as Dreyfus attempts to blow up the tower that they are fighting on. The final fight is a very raw and emotional scene testing Caesar's principles, as he has to go back on his words of ape don't kill ape, which is obviously something Koba is guilty of doing anyway. And so, with no remorse, Caesar allows Koba to die in a very gripping fight sequence which is supposed to restore order amongst the apes. But the primary focus is really on the internal conflict with Caesar, who is trying to come to terms with what he has done, which is explored a little bit more in the next film. And so with the way this wraps up, the apes beg forgiveness of Caesar, as Malcolm warns of an incoming army, hinting again at the next film. And this film genuinely is an absolute masterpiece in my opinion. I loved the cliffhanger end credit scene, which is kind of ambiguous as to whether or not Koba survived the fall. But this film is phenomenal. It takes a huge inspiration from Battle of the Planet of the Apes to an extent, but its momentum and its originality is definitely what provides a stellar performance all around from everybody involved. The CGI is once again absolutely incredible, if not slightly better than what we had previously, and it explores other means to deliver action, which is something that I didn't really expect from a Planet of the Apes movie, and just has some incredible characters showcasing advancements and evolution within the apes in such a short period of time. And that's why I'm going to rank this at my number 1 spot. And last up, we have the conclusive third film for closing off this trilogy released in 2017, and that is War for the Planet of the Apes, which has a very simplistic plot. It's essentially a revenge story after humans invade Caesar's home and kill his loved ones, and so the apes set out for justice by wiping out a military camp. And so we have an army led by this enigmatic character just simply referred to as the Colonel, an unnamed character played by Woody Harrelson, which was a surprising take for a villain, especially for what he represented in the long run. And this puts the plans that Caesar and his group have to journey to this scouted paradise land on hold, as Caesar sends the majority of the apes on their way, only where a small group stay behind to face this Colonel character. And so as the adventure progresses, they come across a little girl they nickname Nova, obviously yet again another homage to the original movie. And this character foreshadows the devolving of human beings and how this virus has actually evolved itself, making human beings primitive where they can't speak, and it takes away their humanity, which is a really interesting revelation, as we see more revelations in the form of the apes themselves actually degrading what it means to be an intellectual ape. And we see this in the character of Winter, who sells out to the humans for his own survival, as he gives up the location of the ape home, stating that he is actually behind and guilty of providing that information which resulted in the attack on Caesar's loved ones. And this is an interesting concept where some of the apes become slaves out of fear, where they simply refer to them as donkey. The character of Bad Ape, portrayed by Steve Zahn, was definitely a necessity with the dark themes that were being explored at this point of the film. With the spread of disease now making humans kill these primitive humans, and the incoming army from the north, as the colonel terms it, wanting to wipe out him rather than actually wiping out the apes, the sequences towards this level are incredibly intense, where all the apes are captured and forced into slave labor, which gives us some really confrontational moments between Caesar and the colonel. And looking to free the apes, we have the remainder of the travel group from before, with Bad Ape falling and accidentally revealing an underground passage towards where the ape inmates are being kept. This allows for a phenomenal escape sequence and some fantastic character moments where we see the Northern Army coming in to wipe out the colonel. And in this dramatic conclusion, the apes do manage to thankfully retreat and make it out mid-battle, but certainly not without a cost, which leads us to a very sad ending, and one of my favourite moments where Maurice speaks aloud to Caesar in full, and this segment and dialogue exchange is very heartfelt and made for a phenomenal end to this chapter. This last chapter in the modern Planet of the Apes trilogy provoked some very interesting ideas, with some great inspiration taken from some of the original films while also delivering its own unique narrative as well. And for a last chapter, it really did have some interesting evolutionary moments for the apes in particular, such as the cobra hallucinations that Caesar experienced, and the dreams that really did show how far Caesar has evolved mentally. And with this mutation of the virus, this led to human beings becoming a lot more vulnerable, which was an interesting take on humanity's side of things. With the winter aesthetic, this led to a lot of great iconography, and overall was a very enjoyable and albeit very heartfelt last chapter. And I'm hoping to see more from this world, as it has been hinted at that sometime soon we will see more from this world of the Planet of the Apes, and I definitely do hope that is the case. And so I'm going to rank this at the remaining spot number 4, which completes the list. So that's going to do it for my Planet of the Apes Blu-ray and DVD collection overview. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, be sure to leave me a like down below. Let me know in the comments what your favourite Planet of the Apes movie is. And for more collection overviews and reviews, be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel, DVD Review Studios, for more upcoming videos.
Are you threatening me?